everyone. My predecessor, Raj from Suriname, has made my task much easier to represent Dr. Singh here because what he has told you about Suriname holds true for Guyana. But before I make that presentation on behalf of Dr. Singh, I want to challenge you, the Hindu businessmen in here from Bharat and from elsewhere. In Guyana, there are over half of the individuals in that country, the population, are of Indian descent. And of that, the majority of them, 45%, are Hindus. We went there in the 19th century. My great grandfather left uh, Gaya in 1888. And in the four or five generations since, we have established ourselves there. So between Trinidad in the Caribbean, Guyana, and Suriname in South America, we have about 2 million people of Indian descent, of which over half are Hindus. Now, I want to challenge you in this way that there have been three waves of Hindus historically. The first wave was probably in the year from the year 1000 onwards, and they went east. And that is how our civilization, our Hindu civilization, spread to what we call now Southeast Asia through Cambodia, Thailand, East Indies. And who were those individuals that spread our civilization? They were business people. They were businessmen, possibly businesswomen, who went east and they made tremendous profits. But in doing so, they also held themselves out as Hindus, practiced their business as Hindus, did not go out and proselytize, but they changed those people, not by converting them, but by showing them how to be part of a superior culture. The second wave was to countries like Suriname, Fiji, South Africa, and they made tremendous profits. But in doing so, they also held themselves out as Hindus, practiced their business as Hindus, did not go out and proselytize, but they changed those people, not by converting them, but by showing them how to be part of a superior culture. The second wave.
And a very good evening to you. Welcome to Politics 101 on a Thursday night. And we played part of that clip that we've been covering these last couple of days. Mr. Ravi Dev, a well known Indianist, Indian rights leader, who has now uh, become the ideologue of those who want to dominate our Guyana and are using all the means at our disposal to do that. Brother Dev was once a power sharer, meaning he once believed that Africans and Indians should share executive power in Guyana, that both ethnic groups had their own concerns, their own security concerns, their own fears, political, economic, and otherwise, and that the best solution to our problems were to share power. But since the return of the PPP to office in the controversial, disputed 2020 elections, Mr. Dev has changed his mind. He feels that we should no longer share power, but which party is able to win crossover votes, that party should govern. So he has abandoned, if you will, an amicable solution to our ethnic concerns, and has embraced a form of electoralism that does not take into consideration the security and other concerns of the ethnic groups. We stumbled a second time on that presentation Mr. Dev made some 8 years ago in India, where he was addressing Indian business people, Hindu business people, Hindus, and he was urging them to come to Guyana. And he prefaced his remarks with that part that we just played there about Hindus being a superior culture, representing a superior culture. Now, that has become problematic for us as far as Dev is concerned, because perhaps, in my estimation, it explains his change of mind. When he was making those remarks, we had not yet found oil, but he was telling the Indian Hindu businessmen about the great business opportunities in Guyana. He was telling them to come, get your cake and eat it. Come and make money. Come and get some of Guyana's resources to help to build India as India faces its competition with China and other evolving powers. He was inviting the superior culture to come and to make money, but also to spread that culture. He was arguing that when those Indians come to Guyana, they will be in India, for the people would have spread that civilized culture, that superior culture, sorry. He made reference to the fact that other ethnic groups celebrate Hindu holidays. Didn't say how those Hindu holidays came into being, but the fact that we celebrate Hindu holidays, the rest of us, he didn't put it down to creolization. He didn't put it down to racial mixing. He put it down to the overpowering influence of that superior. So tonight we want to continue that conversation, and I have Brother Vincent Alexander here. Vincent has been thinking, writing about these issues. There's been a group of us going back to the days of power sharing, when the debate of power sharing got very heated in the late 90s and early 2000s on both sides. From the PNC, you had people like Vincent Alexander, Sherwood Lowe, Aubrey Norton, McAllister, I think, was part of that group of people in the PNC who said the time had come for us to look at sharing political power. Of course, you had persons like myself and Takumo Gunse. Guyana was still around. Guyana had first floated that idea of power sharing way back in 1961. But those of us in the younger generation at that time, some of us were involved. On the other side of the aisle, we had Rafi Def, of course, with his group Roar. You had people like Moses Nagamoto. I still have an article that Moses wrote in the Chronicle at that time, arguing for power sharing. So there was a group of us who argued for power sharing and got, well, we didn't get, we can't claim credit, but Desmond Hoyt, who at first was a skeptic, um, in 2002, just before he died, he said power sharing was an idea whose time had come, and in an official way, committing the PNC towards power sharing. Since then, of course, the PNC has made good. Um, first sought power sharing with the PPP. That didn't work out. We haven't figured out yet whether it was Jack Dio who scuttled it or Mrs. Jagan. But my understanding is Jack Dio said it was scuttled by Mrs. Jagan. But that didn't work out. And then Robert Corbyn turned to the WPA. Together they formed the APNU. And then they joined with the AFC to form the coalition that won office in 2015. But in the interim, a group of us had continued to talk about ways to bring about real, genuine transformation in terms of our social relations, our ethnic relations. And Vincent has been part of that group. Nigel Hughes, myself, Eric Phillips, and Ravidev continued to be a support of the issues. And we've had, talks and public programs probing the idea and so forth. But as I said, over the last couple of years, Ravidev has moved away from that. And then we found this video. So Vincent and I are going to have that discussion tonight on what does this presentation from Ravidev tells us, and where do we go from here? Because we on this side, not necessarily political party, because we didn't represent our political parties when we were having those discussions, but we thought that some of us on the African side, some of us on the Indian side, independent of political parties, should continue to search for ways of, a kind of cooperation, functional cooperation at best, between the ethnic groups through their political parties. So we want to continue that discussion tonight against the background of Ravidev's revelations. And the question is, do we have people on the other side who are willing to continue that discussion now that Ravidev, for all intents and purposes, no longer is interested in that conversation? And now we have discovered this address, and I think it gives us a peek into why. Let me bring in Vincent Alexander right away, and I want to welcome all of you to Politics 101 tonight, wherever you're joining us from. Good evening, Vincent.
Hi, good evening, David.
Just a couple of hours ago, you and I were at homegoing service for Sister Clementine. I don't know.
Marshall.
Clementine Marshall. I don't know why. Sister Clementine Marshall, who was a live wire for ACDA, but became more than just a live wire for ACDA, became the embodiment of what we have been talking about in this program in the last couple of years, and that is an African consciousness of itself in Guyana, an African awareness of its cultural roots. She came to embody that in a real serious way. She was not one of the well-known names because she was in the political arena, the party political arena, and so her name was not known in a popular way. But she was certainly a pillar for the last 3 years in trying to hold the African community together and to chart new ways. So I would like to start with you paying a tribute to her before we get into our substantive discussion.
Thank you very much, David. Indeed, it's timely for us to do that. Sister Marshall passed and has been interned today. Sister Marshall was essentially an activist of AGDA. But as you may know, AGDA has been at the center for some time now, from the 90s to present times, at the center of African Guyanese activism. And so that provided Sister Marshall with an opportunity through AGDA to herself make a contribution to the African Guyanese community. And she made what I would call a selfless contribution. In every area of activity that AGDA was involved in, one could find the involvement of Sister Marshall. She was what one may be referred to as a real grassroots activist, but an activist who had acquired knowledge, who had acquired skills, and who was prepared and, in fact, used her knowledge and skills to enhance the African Guyanese community. When you talk about Sister Marshall, we know that she was involved with the culinary art. In fact, she did that as a business sometimes. We know that when it came to wraps, head wraps, that Sister Marshall was someone who used to teach African Guyanese the various head wraps and what they meant. We know that she was involved in the public education exercise, and along with her comrades from AGDA, would go from village to village, sharing with the people of African descent about their heritage, about their history, and about their culture. We know that she was integral to AGDA's ongoing work with the youth, much of which is done at the Aquaba Center and some external work as well. She was extremely active with the group as well. An important aspect of Sister Marshall is that as a member of AGDA, she became kind of matriarchal in the African Guyanese community. She might not have been somebody who the general population knew about, but certainly in terms of the reparation movement, in terms of AGDA, and I dare say in terms of the PADG, which represents a cluster of African Guyanese organizations. She was recognized as a pillar in the African Guyanese community. And not only a pillar, but a pivot and a hub, in the sense that very often she was the one who was looked to when there was need to resolve conflict, when there was need to bring the community together. She was the one who played that role of bringing the community together, the one who stood above the fray and emphasized that we must be united on based on our commonalities. So she was really an asset to the African Guyanese community, and her life, I would say, was an exemplar. Why would I say that? When one looks at her life, one can see the way she treated family, her own family. She was the mother of uh, four girls and one boy, and she really had a closely knitted family unit, herself, husband, and children. And so, in that regard, she's an exemplar because the family is the basic unit in society, including the African society. And she exemplified a good family to which we can look uh, for an example. But this idea of family, she took it beyond blood family, and the way she operated at AGDA, that too is an extended family. And I dare say that the entire African community, in many regards, she saw as family because the work that she did, though it was done from the platform as AGDA, it is work that reached into the wider African Guyanese community, and I dare say the wider Guyanese community. And so she really treated that entire community as family and became matriarchal in that community in the way in which she contributed to the activism in that community, the growth and development of that community. I remember personally working with Sister Marshall and projects we may have had in AGDA, myself not necessarily being a member of AGDA. And that talks about her, the way she reached out beyond the membership of AGDA, working with Uncle Stan, who was deceased some years ago, doing real work in relation to developing the physical facilities of AGDA, doing real work in terms of the school that AGDA has. She was a real contributor to that school as well, being involved in a lot of fundraising to make sure that there were some resources to get the work of AGDA done as they sought to reach out in the community. And so we really lost a sister who made a tremendous contribution. And we must not see her loss in negative terms because she imparted so much to us that we could see her as someone who has bequeathed to us a legacy, which legacy, if we not be a factor of growth and development and Africanness in the African Guyanese community. So to her close family, to her extended family, I think it's opportune once again to extend our condolences and to see that what we need to do is to celebrate her life, to emulate her life. And in that way, her life will continue to be a contribution to the enhancement of the life of people of African descent and to Guyana at large.
Vincent Alexander paying tribute there to Sister Marshall, Sister Clementine Marshall, who passed away a couple of weeks ago and was buried today. Vincent and I joined other better known in terms of public persona African activists to give her a grand send-off this afternoon. Vincent, another a stalwart of our politics, Ashton Chase, passed away. I think he's going to be cremated tomorrow. I don't know to what extent that you knew Ashton Chase, but I know that he was for a little while part of the Burnhamite PPP, which became the PNC, something that is not well known, and that he eventually left the PPP when he joined the World Communist Movement. And I know you're somewhat of a political historian, so would you mind giving us some comments on Ashton Chase?
I would prefer to see Ashton Chase from two perspectives. The pre-PPP perspective, where he joined with Chedi and I can't remember the other name right now.
Justin Hubbard.
Yes, Justin Hubbard.
And Janet Jagan.
Form what would be considered the precursor
yes.
to the People's Progressive Party. Ashton Chase has to be seen in the context of multiculturalism. Because when he joined and at the inception of the People's Progressive Party, Ashton Chase was really seen to be someone who was representing the African Guyanese community. And because he was seen to be someone who was representing the African Guyanese community, he was initially being quoted to be one of the co-leaders of the People's Progressive Party. But in some regards, he was shy in some regards in terms of ultimate office in politics. That was manifested when he did not quite come forward in terms of the People's Progressive Party. And then we saw Burnham emerging and becoming the co-leader of the People's Progressive Party. And if I can digress a bit, and this is related to what we're going to discuss later, the fact that the People's Progressive Party saw it necessary at its inception to have co-leaders, and they consciously did that in terms of an African Guyanese and an Indo-Guyanese, was a recognition at that time of the nature of our society and a recognition of the need for the people of African descent and the people of Indian descent to work together. You know, very often people talk about the party breaking up and things falling apart without giving recognition to the peculiarity of that formation, which consciously sought to bring together the people of African descent and the people of Indian descent. Many may not know, but Ashton Chase was also the first person that the People's Progressive Party had proposed for the presidency.
In
When
1970.
Arthur
Yeah.
became the president, he was the candidate of the People's Progressive Party. He didn't make the cut then. Uh, Arthur Chung, later Arthur Chung became president. But I think Ashton Chase has to be held up far more prominence, in my view, in terms of his involvement in the trade union movement. He was there almost from the inception, alongside Critchlow. He was one of the persons alongside Critchlow. He predates all the
He
other
was the
guys
secretary of the
of the
Critchlow's
British
District
Guyana
and
Labor,
Labor Union.
Labor
Yeah.
Union. So he's been there. He's predated Burnham. He's predated Jagan, and all those guys in terms of the trade union movement. And we saw him continuing to be a stalwart in the trade union movement, and being, in fact, the founder of NASI, a union which is still a very active union today. He may have, in some regards, been ideological and I dare say Leninist, in so far as, Lenin always saw the trade union movement as a critical movement, as a partner with the Communist Party, because that's where the working people are found. And so, in many regards, Ashton lent to the People's Progressive Party that bastion of the working class, the trade union movement, in terms of the alignment of the union he formed with the People's Progressive Party. But he has to be recognized for the contribution he made to the development of trade unionism. And I think we can still point to his work on trade unionism, the trade union in Guyana, history of the trade union in Guyana, as a seminal work on trade unionism in Guyana. And no matter how much the trade union movement develops or disintegrates, whenever one is going to speak about the history of trade unionism in Guyana, his seminal work still has to be a point of reference in that regard. And also, his practice as a lawyer. In many regards, he specialized in trade union law, and we saw him being involved in important landmark cases in Guyana in relation to labor relations as well. So Ashton has to be seen as one of the founders of the political movement in Guyana, one of the founders of the trade union movement, and one who has contributed and should be recognized for his contribution to the growth and development of the political movement and to the aspirations of Guyana as a nation state.
And Vincent, I'm very glad you made that point about how careful the early PPP, the nationalist PPP, sort of deal with the race issue. Because if you look at the first cabinet there, Mrs. Jagan is in that pitch in the middle, but she wasn't a cabinet member. She was the general secretary of the PPP, and so she was posing. But the cabinet were 6 men, 3 African Guyanese, and 3 Indian Guyanese. From left to right there, you have Dr. Lachman Singh, Sidney King, Nawi Yusi Kwayana, Forbes Burnham, Janet, of course, in the middle, Janet Jagan, Chetty Jagan, Jainarine Singh and Ashton Chase on the far right. Um, uh, three Africans, three Indians. And when one spoke to, I speak to Guyana a lot because he was very much part of that. He had joined the PAC along with people like Ralph Boise Ramkaran.
Boise Ramkaran.
Right, although they weren't founders, they joined the PAC, which I noticed the PPP historians don't mention. And Ramkaran became treasurer of the PPP when they were formed in 1950. Guyana was an assistant general secretary, and he told me that they paid special attention to race and racial unity because they understood the dynamic of the country. So I appreciate the point that you made there about the co-leadership. And that co-leadership is interesting because Burnham was chairman and Chedi Jagan was the legislative leader.
Head of the parliamentary group.
Head of the parliamentary group. He wasn't the leader of the party. The leader of the party was the chairman because the constitution was modeled after the constitution of the People's National Party in Jamaica. In fact, I think Burnham on his way home stopped in Jamaica.
In fact, Burnham was recommended by a prominent Jamaican politician who had met him in London.
Yes.
Recommended to Chedi by that politician who said that he had seen someone with tremendous potential.
Are you talking about
RBO? To give leadership. And in fact, Burnham came to Guyana via Jamaica, where in a sense he did an internship in Jamaica before he came home.
Yes.
A political internship.
Yes, I'm aware of that. And so basically, Chedi Jagan was leader of the legislative group and Burnham was leader of the party. In that sense, they were co-leaders. And that's something that, again, the historians on the other side don't factor in. And what I learned in some research this past week is that Ashton Chase actually spoke on the PNC platform. It wasn't the PNC, but it was the Burnhamite PPP in the 1957 election. When he came back from studying, he had a very close relationship with Burnham and spoke on the Burnhamite PPP platform in 1957. And then went back to the PPP from 61 to 68. And after 68, he left purportedly because he was not happy with the PPP's joining of the World Communist Movement. So Ashton Chase is not a straightforward. I see he's being lauded in the media as the PPP, but his relationship with that party, just as Guyana's relationship, with the PPP is not quite straightforward. But certainly, Ashton Chase leaves a lot for us to ponder as we try, even 70 years later, to make sense of the politics of that early period of the nationalist movement from 1947 to 1955. Vincent, let's move to Mr. Ravi Dev's presentation. When you looked at that presentation, what was your initial response?
Well, in many regards, it reminded me of my first disposition to Ravi Dev. When Ravi Dev returned, he was a prolific writer in Tabard News. And if one read at that time what he was writing, one could sense the Hindu triumphalism and the Hindu, it was really what I would refer to not as a classical Hindu. He was one of these far left, so to speak, uh, Hindu uh, leaders and really spoke to everything from the standpoint of uh, Hinduism and recognizing and trying to represent uh, Hindu interests. And I'm specifying Hindu interests as opposed to Indian interests. Hindu interests as opposed to Indian interests. He is not one of those persons who spoke to the natural evolution of people. He was one of those persons who, through uh, his work, sought to ensure, in fact, the purity, purism of the Hindus in Guyana, that they should not be uh, absorbed, they should not assimilate, they should continue to be true to Hinduism as traditionally and originally espoused. That's how I saw him. And in that context, he often referred to people of African descent as Creoles, and in a disparaging manner. Why I say that? Because he saw Creolism as a watering down of a culture, and therefore warned Hindus not to be Creolized, because it means they would lose their purity, as much as he described people of African descent as being Creolized. And so they lost their originality in some regards and became uh, inferior to what they might have been before, and certainly inferior to other ethnic groups, and the Hindus in particular, who were supposed to retain their culture. And so that's where I saw him in his earlier period here in Guyana. And then during that earlier period, he called, in fact, for the establishment of a federal system where
Yeah.
he talked about the division of Guyana into four states. And I found that also very, very interesting, the way in which he defined geographically those four states.
Mhm.
Uh, he saw Berbice as an Indo dominated state. He saw Demerara as an Afro dominated state. And then he divided Essequibo into two parts, one part dominated by the Indians and one part dominated by the Amerindians. What I found of tremendous interest in the Essequibo situation was that he included in parts of the dominated Indian state areas that were essentially populated by Amerindians, but which bore the minerals, the minerals.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So let them could go to the Amerindians, but when you got closer to the coast in terms of Madhya area and the northwest area, he included those in the Indian
Indians,
dominated
yes.
state where the mineral was located. And I had a problem with his disposition in terms of the geographic segregation of Guyana, because in effect, what he was doing, he was limiting the African Guyanese who had worked across this entire country in building its civilization to Demerara, the state or the county that is leasing down, that is leasing down. And he was bequeathing to the Indians a Essequibo in particular with the hinterland part that was most endowed. And so I had a difficulty with that, separating apart from the fact that the way Guyana evolved in terms of its demography, one cannot, except to some regards in relation to the Amerindians, associate this place called Guyana with any one ethnic group. I normally look at Guyana as a cake that's a ribbon kind of cake. You have the indigenous people, then came the Africans, and they made a contribution across the board to the development of Guyana. Then you had the Indians, who I would say has made a contribution across the board as well. But you can then take this place where we've all made contributions and separate it out to give one ethnic group a particular part and another ethnic group a particular part. There's no, uh, there's no basis, there's no logic of that kind of separation of Guyana based on the way in which we've all contributed to its development in that ribbon kind, you know, historical way, because you have the first, you have the second, you have the third contributors, maybe, and then you have the collective contribution, which one could consider to be ongoing. So I had a difficulty with the way he approached what he considered to be the resolution of the problem, which he called the problem of insecurity, Indian physical insecurity. And I emphasized that concern I had, because as he did this dividing Guyana into parts and making Demerara the Afro-dominated part, you know what he actually did as well? He left the majority of Indians in Demerara. So I can't see the logic of the insecurity that he was trying to resolve. And you create 4 states, and in one state, which is the least endowed state, has the greatest population, and had and still has the greatest number of Indo-Guyanese.
Yeah.
And you're calling that the Afro-dominated state. So I don't see what problem he's really trying to solve. I don't see the problem he's trying to solve, but I do see what was going to happen in Essequibo and what was going to happen in Berbice, and the possibility of outward migration as well, out
Yes.
of Demerara into those more endowed states, both in terms of the physical size and in terms of the mineral endowment. And so one has to start to understand Ravidev from that purest Hindu perspective and its application to the resolution of what he called insecurity problem of the people of Indian descent. And probably I should not refer to them that way when I am talking about Ravidev, because coming to what he said, he didn't see them as people of Indian descent. He sees them as Indians. And so again here, I'm seeing a defiance of the sociological understanding of people's evolution. One would assume that people are defined on one hand by their physical location, but more importantly, by their socialization and their culture. And in that regard, if we have an emergent Guyana, one could see someone being referred to as a Guyanese and attaching to that for historical and heritage purposes origins, so Afro-Guyanese or Indo-Guyanese or Chinese Guyanese, because they're going to be commonalities that naturally should evolve across the board of these different ethnic groups that makes them something common and different from any other group of people, though they will be bearing their heritage, which would be Indo or Afro or Chinese or European. But the way Ravidev has addressed this question, he's not speaking about that natural evolutionary process. He has been one who has pushed back on that process and tried to create a consciousness that would resist that process, and therefore, in some regards, retain India in Guyana, something that is not necessarily new and original to Ravidev, because we need to go back to the period of the when the indentureship came to an end. there was a group of Indo-Guyanese when indentureship came to the end, who sought to continue Indian immigration in league with the British and the Indian government. It is called the colonization plan, where there were some Indian leaders, some Indian, let me call them businessmen, that word becomes important.
Yeah.
Some Indian businessmen who actually drop a plan that says, let's have more Indians come to Guyana. And what they will do, they will come virtually as if they were coming as indentures, which meant they were going to be coming to work on plantations and in businesses of these business Indians, but that they would graduate over time. They'll be granted land and graduate out of the working class into land ownership and business class, but that graduation would see more Indians coming, more Indians coming. So it'll be a continuous uh, migration of Indians into Guyana in a manner that would, on one hand, assure Guyana of a majority of Indians, which has already happened by that time, but not only a majority of Indians, but Indians who would be facilitated both in terms of the burgeoning business by those who are bringing the new Indians, and in terms of the agriculture sector by virtue of the lands to be allocated after a number of years to the Indians uh, who were being brought under that colonization scheme. And so when Ravi Dev speaks, I think in 2014, if not mistaken, in a sense, he is revitalizing that scheme, which was in some regards formally jettisoned in 1919 because they did not get the Indian government at that time took the position that the provinces from which Indians were going to be brought would have to consent before they allowed Indians to come. And I don't think the provinces gave the consent. So that the formal scheme, with the Indian government, the businessmen here in Guyana, and the colonial government never got off the ground. But there were continued elements in Guyana that represented what the scheme intended. So, for example, we saw a lot of the land development that took place in Guyana during the period after indentureship facilitated uh, land to the Indo-Guyanese more than to any other group of Guyanese. And those lands were not lands that were necessarily acquired through purchase. There were some instances where Indians, particularly in places like Palmyra, did purchase villages and have their own villages established. But there were a lot of schemes, including Blackbush Polder,
Right.
including Blackbush Polder,
Right.
which were settlement schemes that were funded by the state and facilitated Indian involvement in agriculture and in the rice industry, which they dominate up to today. So that informally we see that what was proposed did gain some real roots. And in many regards, what we're seeing now is a proposition by Ravi Dev that really would represent a renaissance of that formal system where Indians would come to Ghana, retain their Indianness, come primarily to do business in a society where business has been skewed towards one particular ethnic group, not because of the inability of others, but because of the way in which the colony evolved and the way in which the colonizers, the plantation owners, facilitated the growth of ethnic groups in particular ways. They facilitated the growth of the Indian and the Portuguese in terms of commerce. They stifled the growth of people of African descent in terms of agriculture and commerce and facilitated their growth in the public service. And so the question of where Indians are located is not merely a question of their being. It's a question of the facilitation that would have occurred under the colonial government. And so we are seeing another attempt at building on that and that facilitation in a circumstance, and this is where it becomes even more critical, where Ravi Dev, in referencing what happened in Asia, Cambodia and those countries, unequivocally, and here is where I take Ravi Dev to task. I might have been silent otherwise. Ravi Dev unequivocally said that the Indians who had gone to Cambodia and to Thailand and wherever else had a superior culture.
Also,
And whenever you talk about superiority in terms of culture, and you talk about superiority in terms of ethnicity, you're talking as a racist and you're talking racism, because that's the exact definition of racism. Racism speaks to the question of a system where people are seen to be superior to others, and therefore that system gives privileges and rights to those who are superior over those who are inferior. And that is the origin of Guyana, the coming of the Dutch, seeing themselves as superior to the Amerindians in the first instance, to the Africans in the second instance, and to every other group in the third instance, building a hierarchical system where they are superior. And in fact, where they create superiority in that hierarchy with the African Guyanese and the Amerindian Guyanese being at the bottom. And here's Ravi Dev talking about that superiority that fashioned the success of people in Cambodia and in other places. And saying to the Hindus in India, come to Guyana. You have fellow Hindus who will facilitate you into business, into wealth, and that this facilitation is not necessarily about development of Guyana. This facilitation is about your accumulation of wealth and the further facilitation of India in its competition with China for a place on the world stage. So that Ravi Dev is not talking about a Guyana. He's talking about that colony that they talked about of India in Guyana and the growth development of others. And here, in the contemporary situation, it's very clear that the competing force is that of the Chinese, both in terms of the individual Chinese here in Guyana and in terms of the Chinese as a state that has its outreach to other countries in its process of wealth accumulation and world domination. So that we have a serious problem if we in Guyana are to coexist as Guyanese with persons who start off from the standpoint that they are superior, with persons who see us as inferior. In that regard, I want to make a reference to a close colleague of Ravi Dev, and that's Vishnu Bisram. It's about a year and a half ago. Vishnu Bisram wrote a letter in our columns, giving recognition and accolades. So I think a now deceased Indo-Guyanese from the quarantine, who was one of the Indian leaders But what I found most interesting about Bisram's uh, recognition of that Indo-Guyanese, I don't remember the name offhand right now. He said that one of the major contributions of that Indo-Guyanese in the quarantine was the way in which he ensured that Indo-Guyanese resisted being creolized. And I call creolization a natural process. That Indo-Guyanese was praised. So we see here again the question of this Hindu brother seeing the pure Hindu as superior, rejecting being quote unquote diluted or assimilated, and maintaining his purity in a place where there's diversity and where we're all supposed to be uh, equal. We're all supposed to be equal. Of course, we are not all equal because of historical circumstances, but we are faced with a decade and with a consciousness that says we have to put the mechanisms in place, the equitable mechanisms for equalization, so that we can in fact all be equal insofar as we are not disadvantaged in accessing the wealth of the nation. And here is this ongoing contention that no, don't be like them. Continue to be poor, continue to be superior. Come to the place where there is wealth. Come to the place where you have brothers who can give you access to the wealth. And in so doing, maintain your Hindu purity and your affinity to India. In India's uh, continued portrayal by some of itself as a superior culture, as Ravi Dev described it when he referred to what happened in Asia and specifically in places like Cambodia and Thailand. That runs against the grain of what the Granger government was trying to do, where Granger talked about social cohesion.
Mhm.
It's interesting to see the idea that Granger chose, social cohesion. Because if one is a student of sociology, there are critics of integration,
Right.
where they sometimes see integration as an act of acculturation,
Right.
where the dominant culture assimilates everyone else into that dominant culture. But cohesion starts off with the recognition of diversity,
Yes.
but recognizes that we are located in one place and that we are an emergent nation state where our economic relations and other relations are not necessarily ethnic, and therefore we have to find ways and means to coexist, to have cohesion, even as we maintain our diversity. So let me make it clear. We are not discussing this matter against the background of Hindus not being Hindu. We're discussing this matter against the background of us living in one place called Guyana, having an emergent state where there are integrated systems, and therefore finding ways and means by which we can coexist with mutual respect for our differences once the differences do not impinge upon the existence of others. So we have to find ways in which we preserve our differences, but not to the detriment of others. So each group preserves its difference, its diversity, whereas we try to coalesce and be cohesive in terms of our commonalities. And the bigger system facilitates diversity. So that's another element of the cohesion. And in that way, you can probably work towards what may be called one people, one nation with one destiny, which is quite different from a one Guyana.
Yeah.
Because all a one Guyana describes, all a one Guyana describes is a place where we are located.
Yes.
Does not describe what happens in that place as a oneness.
Thank you, Vincent. Quite a mouthful there, and the audience is really appreciating it. And I think your points are well taken. We have no issue with Indians coming to Guyana for purposes of doing business. What we are taking issue with is the notion of superiority, a superior culture, and we are taking issue with the fact that Ravi is not talking about asking them to come here to build Guyana, but to use Guyanese resources to build India in its competition with China and other forces. That's where our objectives are. Vincent, something has become so much clearer to me. I've been listening to Ravi as you've been, because you've been on programs with him. And he has been talking about black people and business, black people and business. And he quotes Mr. Hoy telling him that he set up something and for black people, I think one of the companies that came here put it on the East Bank. And Mr. Hoy tell him that on Friday evening, the guys don't want to work, they're jumping over the fence to go and party. And he has been painting this picture of this stereotype of Africans not interested in business, can't do business. And it has nothing to do with structures or anything. It has to do with something that's innate in their culture. Now, here is he linking the superior culture controlling Southeast Asia, and they were businessmen. He's linking the superiority to business. So for him, business is something that is innate, that is natural, that it comes from God. You have it or you don't have it. Reminds us, of course, you are sociologists, of Weber Protestant ethic as far as capitalism is concerned. Over to you, Vincent.
There is, one has to remember the nature of the Indian society, which is built on caste.
On cast.
And I want to say two things here. I want to quickly say that not all Indians are what Ravidev is describing. And we are seeing, even in the contemporary India, the problems in India under a government which seems to be aligned with the Ravidevs in terms of Hindu fundamentalism. That's the term I missed earlier. In terms of Hindu fundamentalism. The problem is in India today. And the Hindu way of life, I'm not saying religion, I'm repeating what Ravidev said the other day on the program. Hindu is a way of life.
It's a way of life, yes.
Has accepted hierarchical system, which they refer to as caste, and we may refer to as class. It has, however, not embraced class struggle. It has embraced an acceptance of caste, an acceptance of caste. So that what we see in here is not only what we see in here is also a class phenomenon. Because even in the colonization plan, it was Indian business bringing other Indians who they would have exploited and then relieved to bring another set to exploit. So it's a class chaos situation that we would have to confront And it's in that context that Ravidev talks about the neoliberal
Yes. Yes.
economy. Let the economy solve the problem. Let the economy solve the problem, competition.
Yes. Yes.
But he's doing that in a society where the structures, where the legal system, where the status quo has forcibly, forcibly imposed a class structure on people of African descent, the status structure on people of African descent. But people of African descent who have demonstrated that they are naturally otherwise. They are naturally otherwise. That demonstration came about starting off with their ability to save money during the period of apprenticeship and to acquire lands with those monies. What they did, they acquired lands. They acquired the main means of existence and the main means of reproduction. But we saw that too
We seem to. We seem to be. Let's see
that
here. We
too
seem to.
was pushed back against, and the people of African descent were forced off of the lands into employment, and into the mining sector. And that did not simply impact the people of African descent materially, it impacted them psychologically. People of African descent, faced with what the colonizers were doing to them, found stability in employment, as opposed to trying to farm and have their farms flooded and live in a state of instability. And so it helped to fashion a psyche that has been retained, the people of African descent. And therefore, when you talk about Guyana, you have to talk about a state which has to understand the way people have evolved and recognize why they have evolved the way they have evolved. And so, for example, it can be a state that tells you people of African descent are monopolizing the public service and should give others a chance, because it is the very evolution of the state that put them there. It can be a state that doesn't recognize the psychological state of the people of African descent, and therefore what mechanisms are required for a shift in that psychological state in the pursuit of equalization. The state has responsibilities. But if you have a state that does not recognize that, as we have, then we have a state which continues to perpetuate and to perpetrate. And whilst doing that, looking upon us as being inferior, when we have demonstrated historically what we are capable of. We didn't come here as slaves. We came here as people who were able to work the lands, to dig the canals, and to do all that was required from an engineering and other perspective to build Guyana. A people who were told after building Guyana that they had to be apprentices. People understand what was that? Imagine I work on the sugar estate, my people, for hundreds of years. We doing all the work on the estate. And when the time comes for us to be so-called freed, you say to us, you got transition, we got to make you an apprentice, you got to understand how to live off the estate. When in fact, we were the ones that were making the estate workable, viable, and beneficial to the owners. And so it tells us a lot about why a conscious world has declared a decade for the people of African descent under a theme, recognition, justice, and development. They are saying that these people have been imposed in a regime of recognition deficit. They're not being recognized for who they are. These people have been placed in a regime of justice deficit. They have not been treated fairly. And as a consequence, they have suffered development deficit. And in any system of cohesion, we have to understand that there has to be mechanisms of equity to redress those historical wrongs, to bring us to that point where we can be on the equal platform to access the opportunities that this land provides for us. Many of the opportunities which are only possible because we played a great, if not the greatest role in the civilization of this place. That civilization, which is the platform for all that has happened after, except not being the platform, the continued degradation of the people of African descent.
Vincent Alexander here tonight. We're using the address by Ravidev as the backdrop to, as Vincent has done tonight, to broaden the discussion beyond just a simple critique of Ravidev, but to really broaden it into discussion about the state of race relations in Guyana and how we could possibly move forward to improve it. One thing that we want to make clear, as Vincent has said, is that we are not condemning or criticizing Ravidev for being Hindu or for being Indian or for looking after Hindu interests or Indian interests. He's free to do that. And in fact, in many regards, we welcome that. All we are saying is that if you start off from the presumption that one group is superior, one culture is superior from the other, then the outcome can be nothing else but domination by the superior group. And African Guyanese, for the last 3 years, have been linking their own sense of being dominated to the actual behavior of the government and the way in which the government is using the state. So they're not talking here about a subjective feeling alone, because feeling, of course, is subjective, but they're talking about a sense in which the system is not working for them. In the wake of the Dharamlal fiasco, the Dharamlal nastiness, the question is being asked, is the system working? Is the legal system working? Is the governmental system working? Is the parliamentary system working? Is the system of social justice working? Is the legal system, is it working, the system, and so on? So the system, and we are very glad that it took the Darren Lal thing to open a lot of people's eyes, because this is what IPADG has been arguing. This is what the United Nations has argued. It has said, despite advances in law and rights that are put in constitution, African people across the world are still treated unfairly. So it means that more has to be done than just putting some laws on the books. and put in your constitution that we have equal rights. I remember last year, Vincent, when we said talked about an emerging apartheid state. None other than the Attorney General said, but we cannot be an apartheid state because the laws of Guyana does not permit an apartheid state. And I remember saying, what the fool is he? But then later on, I realized that he's coming from a thought process that if you dumb down the way in which structures and institutions in the society are reflection of thought processes, then you are allowing yourself to get away with dominating people without being caught, because you're saying the systems don't allow me, so I can't dominate. It's like somebody saying, I can't be a thief, man, because my father is the preacher. Vincent Alexander, your closing thoughts.
I didn't get that.
No, your closing thoughts, you. And you
My
can
closing,
comment on anything that I said there just now.
my closing thoughts is that we are fortunate in that we are a period of rising consciousness of the people of African descent, and that we have got to continue to work among our people to raise that consciousness. And our people with that consciousness have got to continue to come to the table demanding the kind of changes that will bring about equalization. You can't talk about equality among unequal people. And the extent to which you're talking about relations in the society are exercised through institutions and are regulated by laws. And if those institutions and those laws have historically been skewed against people, then you can't retain them and tell us we are equal. You have to create the platform. And that platform in this circumstance can only come through equitable action that then allows for redress of the historical wrong, equalization. And from the standpoint of equalization, then you may have a normal society. Obviously, the problem we have is that we are not coming from the same mindset. They're different mindsets. And the extent to which they're different mindsets, we have to get to one thing in common. That is to accept that they're different mindsets. There's a plurality of our society, which is also demonstrated in thought processes, how we see life, how we see things. And that because of that plurality, we've got to come to the table where we have a conversation that seeks to accept the plurality, but also accept that we should create a society in which there is, in fact, equality, and therefore to put in place mechanisms, even in the face of that plurality, to create that society. And what comes to mind immediately is a situation where the various groups are represented in a conversation that seeks to identify the problem, determine the solutions to the problem, and to implement those solutions. Outside of that, the society that we're in is dysfunctional in relation to the people of African descent, their well-being, and their development. We cannot continue to live in a dysfunctional society. For example, there's a lot of talk about business in this country, a lot of facilitation of business. We know how that is skewed in terms of who participates in business at which level. What about if our state was far more proactive in facilitating cooperatives so that people of lesser means could enter into the realms of business so that they can too be actively involved in benefiting from the wealth. What we see in our society, rather than facilitation of cooperatives, we see the state being condemning them and trying to take away the resources, which, if they are facilitated, can be put to use to help to redress the problem, bearing in mind the problem is material and psychological, and therefore the redress has got to take place in both realms, the material realm and the psychological realm. Work has to be done on the trauma that people of African descent are affected by as a result of slavery. And don't tell me about history, the talking history. It is proven scientifically that trauma almost can be inherited from one generation to another. And so when you talk about how you deal with the Jews, you have to talk about how you deal with the Africans because they have been affected materially and psychologically. And the world owes us not handouts, they owe us a framework, institutional arrangements that will allow for us to recover from that state it has been imposed upon us.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Thank you so much for coming on tonight. And we will definitely make this, as an old Trinidadian friend of mine used to say, make it a regular occurrence. We will make this a regular feature, and we're coming up to emancipation. So what a time to begin this discussion, because there is so much more to tease out or out of the implications of that address by Brother Rafi Dev. Thank you again, Vincent.
You're most welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. And thank you all. Thank you all again for staying with us. As I said, we're building a consciousness and we're building a movement, because consciousness and movement go together. And it's one of the ways that we can begin to right the wrongs. The primary obstacle before us is inequality and inequity. And we're saying that the way we will have to be that in the short term is with a consciousness that becomes part of a movement. And we are playing our role in doing that. Yes, they will say that we are spewing racism and all the nonsense. Well, Rafi Dev has defined what racism is for us. Even if you all didn't hear our definition before, you've heard this definition, and that is that there is a superior culture. That's the definition of racism. That is giving a meaning to color, skin color. And if you say this skin color represents something that is inherently superior, then you're saying another skin color represents something that is inherently inferior. And when you have these two groups, the one that sees itself as superior, hence the other as inferior, operating within a particular nation state, common borders, common flag, common national anthem, common constitution, but a different sense of who we are inherently are, who we are inherently. That's a recipe, as we would say, in a plural society. We have to constantly search for cohesion, for cohesion, for cohesion. As Professor Nettleford would say, multicultural means that we are different cultures operating on our different silos. But interculturalism means that we are striving constantly to accept the culture of one another, to accept the culture of each group as legitimate, and try in that mosaic to advance our common destiny. We're going to continue this as a regular feature from this week, and with your help, we are going to make more progress as we engage the struggle before us. Good night. See you all tomorrow night. Tomorrow is what? Friday? Yes. See you all tomorrow night.
If you hear that, black is beautiful. Santa Claus. Black is beautiful. It's the texture of lift your